Flacyd is going to be defending the proposition that polyamorous marriage should be legal. Htata is going to be taking the opposition. They'll have 40 minutes to debate. If nobody concedes, then we'll put it to a voting poll to decide the winner of the debate. If it does come to a voting poll, just base your vote on who you think performed better in the debate. And yeah, you guys can get started. Thanks for debating.
All right, so I want Htata to go first because he's tipped me off that his definition of the prompt might be different from what I thought it was.
Fantastic. Okay. First, let's set the ground rules. What is a polyamorous relationship? I would define it as an open, intimate, or romantic relationships with people, like multiple number of people of different like gender identities and sexual orientations. Correct?
Yep, I agree.
Okay, great. Okay, so most of my argument will pertain to the legality of polyamory, as in implementing the laws that support polyamory, not the morality of the action in itself. Any moral argument will be made from the consequences of attempting to or implementing those laws. Okay?
Yep.
Great. Now, the first problem I would have with implementing polyamory is that we are implicitly stating that the state has the right to determine the types of relationships that we can engage in. My question would be, coming from an anarchist perspective, why would I defer to an external entity the right to make laws that determine which kind of sexual relationship I ought to engage in?
So are you making a full opening statement, or do you want me to respond to that?
Go into the second argument first. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
Now, that doesn't mean I'm willing to concede that there might be some positives that would come from such a law. Like polyamory is technically not a legally protected status, like similar to being gay or straight and so on. So there is some room for argument in that, but I will address that ahead. The second argument I would have is if we are fixated on just polyamorous relationships, what about the rest of non-monogamous relationships? There are people who are swingers. There are non-hierarchical polyamory. I would then want a more specific definition of polyamory. But I would much prefer even that we just push for non-monogamous relationships in general, not just polyamorous relationships. And the third argument would be coming from a cultural perspective. Are you familiar with the Canadian pipeline, the Wet'suwet'en people?
No, I don't. Are you talking about the Keystone?
No, there were a group of indigenous people living in Canada, and Canada has the gas pipeline plan of 2020.
Right.
And they are attempting to build those pipelines through the lands of the indigenous people. But according to the Canadian government under the Indian Act, they were given the rights to reserve and govern their lands. They have sovereignty over their lands. And building those pipelines would be, according to, I can't pronounce the name of the monk, but I can give you the citation, that the pipeline is going along rivers. It will go over rivers, and even some instances it will go under 190 kilometers of the proposed route will run through our territory. It threatens our water, our salmon, and our rights, our title, our jurisdiction. The pipeline would also go through areas of cultural significance to the Wet'suwet'en people. Now, what if we legalize the idea of polyamory in a culture that refuses to engage in polyamorous relationships? Let's take, for example, Egypt, a heavily conservative society. It is okay with polygamy, but I highly doubted that the people would agree to have women engage in polyandric relationships. How can we justify such a law? So those are my three arguments. Do you want me to restate them?
No, I was taking notes. Thank you.
Okay.
All right. So before I address some of your opening statements, I have a bit of an opening statement myself.
Go
So
ahead.
I'm taking the position that polyamory, marriage within polyamory, should be legal, and I think there are several reasons for that. First of all, there is no constitutional prohibition on polygamy per se. However, there is a cultural prohibition between the church and state. And as it currently stands, by only allowing monogamous marriage, we're giving a preference to the mainstream Christian hegemony to determine what exactly is a marriage. On the other hand, we're now bringing detriment to every other religion that says that monogamy is not the preferred family structure. The Constitution also protects people's rights to choose what kind of family structure they want and who they want to marry and when. And so by looking at this kind of conflict, you can see that the Constitution does not prohibit polyamorous marriage, but rather has a framework built into it. So there would not be a significant change in the legal framework as it currently stands to simply allow polyamory. Now, going to some of the arguments that you brought up, you talk about some kind of implicit state determinism, that it would be that by allowing polyamory, the state would be saying that this is okay. And I don't think that it is implicit state determinism, because we're not outlawing monogamous marriage. We're simply allowing people to make the choice to validate the relationship that they're already currently in. And so this isn't the state determining what kind of relationships you can be in, but simply acknowledging and allowing a relationship that people are already in. You make a second point that polyamory is not a protected status. And I think there are specific interpretations that you could look to say that polyamory is a sexual orientation that can be protected under specific laws, but whether or not it's protected is irrelevant, because under the First Amendment, the Constitution allows for the free expression of religion. So if your religion or your lack of religion at that says that polyamory is either accepted or preferred, you do have that kind of protection. And under the Ninth Amendment, you have the protection to say that you are allowed to determine your family structure, you are allowed to determine the way that you want your household to function.
So we don't need a law to legalize polyamory?
Well, so right now we have negative laws that say that polyamory, marriage to multiple people, is illegal. So I'm simply saying get rid of those laws. Get rid of those laws and allow the superseding Constitution and the people to decide what kind of relationships they want to be in, and allow people to validate those relationships in the eyes of the law. And I think there's a lot of benefit to be had from that. First of all,
can I interrupt here?
Yeah.
Okay, but if we are getting rid of these laws, aren't we implicitly just arguing that we don't want laws to contain relationships or presuppose the validity of certain relationships? I mean, polyamory is a umbrella term, but still it doesn't encapsulate all non-monogamous relationships, such as swinging.
I don't see how it's comparable to swinging, because we're talking about marriage specifically. So if you are in a monogamously married couple and you choose to be non-monogamous in terms of your sexual relationship, that's not marriage. That's not within the scope of the prompt as we have it. But if you do choose to engage in non-monogamous marriage, then that would come into the scope. And so simply what I'm saying is there's no law that says that monogamous marriage is legal. It's simply assumed or presumed, as you put it. And I'm arguing for equal treatment of non-monogamous polyamorous marriage.
So just non-monogamous polyamorous relationships.
Because there should be a comma in between them. So what would be the difference between a non-monogamous, what would be a non-monogamous relationship that is not polyamorous?
Swinging. Swinging does not contain any emotional relationships. It's primarily
true, but in swinging, we're not talking about marrying the couple that you're swinging with.
No, you do marry the couple that, like, married couples do swinging.
Right, married couples, two monogamously married couples, so only two people would swing with one another, but these two couples aren't marrying each other.
No, they engage in sexual relationships, but they are exclusively monogamous when it comes to emotion.
Right. And so that's not really within our prompt here, because our prompt is marriage. It's already legal for them, for couple A to be married to one another. And it's legal for couple B to be married to one another. But it's currently illegal for somebody in couple A to marry somebody in couple B.
Okay. I agree on that point.
So swinging, whether or not that's legal, is a little bit irrelevant to kind of the debate that we're currently having.
Yeah, true.
And so by saying non-monogamous and polyamorous, I think that we're being more inclusive of the various forms of polyamory that we would be protecting.
Yeah, but it will depend on the wording. A lot of law is always dependent on the wording.
Right, but that's why we have legislatures that are able to amend these things and work out the very details of them. But as our debate currently stands, I think the definition that you had at the outset, that it's multiple people of multiple gender identities marrying who they choose and any number of which that they choose. And I think there's many benefits to be had to that. First of all, through legalization, we now have a record of who is marrying whom, who has been married to someone else. And so I think a lot of people are hesitant to allow polyamorous marriage because we get the idea of cults or coercive marriage. But by having a record of those, the state is better able to enforce fair and equal marriage rather than coercive or illegitimate marriage.
Yeah, and this kind of relates to... Okay, I forgot to mention this in my opening statement, but the Mormons.
Right. So by only allowing for monogamous marriage, we're treating the Mormon religion as secondary to the mainstream Christian religion, which is per se unconstitutional. We are giving constitutional and legal protections to one religion. Rather, we're treating them preferentially as compared to some other religion.
Okay, sure. But,
so not only would we be reconciling kind of this difference and allowing people to validate relationships, and it's very likely relationships they're already in. We're now bringing this into the very provable purview of the state to allow the state to say, actually, you know what? This 14-year-old may be de facto married to this like 76-year-old because they've been acting as a married couple.
Yeah, we are not arguing for age. Yeah.
Right. So they may be in a false marriage, if you will, or what they might deem as a marriage. And right now, they could never validate that. And if we legalize polyamorous marriage, if they tried to validate that, the state would have concrete evidence to be able to investigate that and say, no, you cannot marry a 14-year-old.
My agreement on your argument will be contingent on how the wording of the law is, how... like when I see the consequence of such a law. But because this will take like the entire debate, I'm willing to concede that.
Right. And I don't think that we're talking about some new law coming into effect that says that now polyamorous marriage is legal or whatever kind of wording that you're willing to hold this contingency on, but rather just repealing the part of the law that does not allow for polyamorous marriage or illegal, makes polyamorous marriage is illegal.
Yeah, okay. I'm willing to concede the point because actually opening the constitutions and going law by law is very hard and time consuming. So the next point, let's move on to the next point. The cultural one.
Right. So by saying that there is this cultural detestation of polyamory, that's fine. Some cultures might not be comfortable with that. However, the law does not necessarily rest on comfort. You may be willing to be polyamorous and comfortable with that, or you may not be. And I think it's similar in some respects to homosexual marriage, where There are many cultures that are very uncomfortable with homosexual marriage, but that doesn't mean that it's illegal. Because nobody is saying that now you can only be in polyamorous marriages. It says you can be in a monogamous heterosexual marriage if you want, but you don't have to be.
I mean, I'm not debating the morality of the issue. Of course, it's moral and people ought to engage in those relationships. But how can we actually legalize them? Would we impose, would America impose on the sovereignty of Egypt just to impose those legal laws?
Well, I don't think that if America legalizes polyamory, that forces Egypt to legalize it as well. But if an Egyptian person comes to the United States to be married, their marriage is only valid within the United States. They would have to have that validated in Egypt if they were to return with multiple partners.
Yeah, but how can we actually legalize such a law in a country with a lot of pushback? Like, it's much easier to imagine such a legalization in... Okay, America is somewhat conservative, but let's talk about something that is ultra-conservative like Egypt. How can I go about legalizing such a law in Egypt?
Well, difficulty in legalizing isn't necessarily the same thing as saying it should be legalized. There are plenty of things that are difficult to legalize and have their own pressures associated with that, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be legalized. Practical roadblocks are not the same as theoretical should or should not.
All right, she got me. Fuck, I concede. I can't do this sophistry. Okay, I lose. I concede.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh, man.
If I'm going to get into the debate, I'll be actually arguing against my own beliefs. Plus, I'll be just arguing from semantics.
Yeah, but that's the fun of it.
Htata's just too good faith.
No, I was put into the corner. I would have to pull some shit out of my ass, and I don't like that. No.
Why not? Okay.
But really good debate, guys. Thank you both.
Hey, thanks.
Yeah, thank you.